Hello, and welcome to Circulating Conversations, the podcast where we discuss library topics, genre deep dives, and book recommendations. I'm your host, Rachel, an Adult Services Librarian, and this is my guest,
Jim Steele. I'm happy to be here.
We're so happy to have you. So Jim is the current Poet Laureate for Lake County, and we figured since it was National Poetry Month, a perfect special guest to have on the podcast. And so when did you start being Poet Laureate?
I started being Poet Laureate about 22 months ago.
Wow. And have you enjoyed it?
I have enjoyed it. It's been quite a journey. The biggest challenge, I think, is to get comfortable with reading in front of a lot of people. Mm-hmm. Before that, I was kind of just a small time behind the scenes kind of online guy, right. But it's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, public speaking, terrifying for all.
Yeah.
So as Poet Laureate, what are some of the responsibilities and duties that you undertake?
Well, my main responsibility is that I have to further poetry in Lake County. I have to deepen the footprint. Mm-hmm. And to do that, I've taken part in a lot of local poetry groups, just mm-hmm. sitting in and inviting other people and everything. I've held workshops on publishing poetry online mm-hmm. and publishing books through Amazon.
Right.
And I also have I've also created some events of my own. But my main responsibility is just to get poetry farther out there.
Yeah, absolutely. So how do you feel that impacts the local community by promoting poetry?
Well, I think poetry benefits any community. All it is expression, and poetry has so few rules. It's the best way. I've always said that, if anyone wants to pray in school, all they have to do is call it a poem, and mm-hmm. it's allowed because it's art. Yeah. And so any community can benefit from poetry. Any person can benefit from becoming their own poet.
Absolutely. Can you describe your journey into poetry, how you got started, where your inspiration came from?
Well, believe it or not, I wrote my first poem on January 5th, 1977, mm-hmm. probably before you were born. I'm sure before you were born. And like 90% of the poets out there, it's because I fell in love with a girl and I mm-hmm. had to, express it. So I've been writing for a very long time. I did probably take 15 years off. But I've been mm-hmm. writing steady now for about 5 years, and maybe 10 years, and I have a few books out and everything, and now it's just become therapeutic. I think poetry is the new journaling or the new diary. Mm-hmm. I sit down and I just write just to get something off my chest, and it may turn into a poem, and maybe it won't, but I enjoy it. Yeah,
that's a really good analogy. Yeah, I think that's wonderful. I think people are often intimidated by poetry. What would you say to someone who might be intimidated to get into writing?
Well, I would probably recommend a few readers, a few poets for them to read, because poetry, I love Robert Frost, but poetry is not Robert Frost anymore. Mm-hmm. I think the biggest drawback to poetry is that it's called poetry. People hear the word, it's like right. Amway or something mm-hmm. like that. They automatically get an idea. But I could honestly take an email that you send to your mom and I could turn it into a poem. Yeah. It's nothing more than you just saying how you feel, especially for a poet like me, because I write narrative poetry, which mm-hmm. is just like a conversation a lot of times.
Right.
So I would say just look, whatever's going on inside your head, just sit down at a computer and just write it out.
Yeah. So you mentioned a good idea is to look at a few authors and stuff. Were there any poetry authors that were inspirations for you?
Yes. Early on, there was a poet named Peter McWilliams who has since passed. Of course, like half the world, I loved Mary Oliver as well, who has also passed. These days, I read a lot of Ocean Vuong and Rupi Kaur. Mm-hmm. Rupi Kaur really put poetry on the map for the world. Mm-hmm. Her first book sold more than every other poetry book combined in the last 10 years.
Wow.
Yeah, she's crazy.
That's awesome. You also mentioned you took like a 15-year gap. So what pulled you back in?
Well, I traveled so much during that 15 years. I had a lot of ideas and everything, but it just seems like poetry was something I just wanted to do when I relaxed, and it just seemed like I was on the go all the time. So I finally decided that I would write a few poems, and I entered a contest, and one of the prizes for the contest was that you would get published. So I finished second. So they said, give us a bunch of poems. If we like them, we'll put them in a book. And that's kind of how it got me going again.
Wonderful. Well, we're super glad that you were able to get back into it.
So am
Yes. So poetry is known to have the power to evoke emotions and provoke thought. So what themes and subjects do you find yourself most drawn to when you're writing?
Well, I write a lot about love, but more so I write about a lot about heartbreak. And one of my favorite subjects to write about is grief, which I think gets a bad rap. I think grief has an important part in our process, and so I'm more of a negative subject writer. It's like if I'm in love, I won't write until it all falls apart, and then I'll write and write.
Well, that's cathartic, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think even people that can't relate to a heartbreak poem, I think they pull pieces out of it anyway from their past and say, yeah, I know how that feels, even though my heart's never actually been broken. I know where you're coming from there.
Yeah.
So it's very easy for me to write from that vein. But I can write, with a gun to my head, I can write a happy poem.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a relatability in what you write because, I'm not sure if there's anyone on the planet, excuse me, that hasn't gone through heartbreak or hasn't experienced grief. So I think people can definitely find something in those topics.
Yes, I like to write from different points of view. I've written from the point of view of a tree, from the point of view of wind. I wrote a poem about two twins in the womb, and one was dying, and they were saying goodbye to each other. So I try to look at things from different angles a lot of times.
Yeah.
And I've never been a parent.
Right.
But I can say, okay, this girl's a parent, so let me just imagine I'm her, and I can write a poem from your point of view. So I've written poems about having kids and losing kids, and so it's just... That's
super interesting. I would never have thought about the topic that you just told me you wrote about, but that's super interesting that you're able to put yourself... that's just showing empathy. Being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes and kind of think of the emotions that they might be going through.
Exactly. In a way, it's just like acting, you have to put yourself in the shoes of another person and just write a poem.
Absolutely. Now, poetry also grapples with language and its limitations. So you mentioned that you tend to do narrative poetry. Are there any other particular linguistic devices or techniques that you use frequently?
Well, for a poet, the two main devices are dictionaries and thesauruses, neither one of which I use. A lot of poets make the mistake of creating these lofty poems using language that they would never speak in real life.
Right.
And because I'm a narrative poet, my first copy editor referred to my poetry as conversational. It's just you and me having a cup of coffee, down the road, and that's kind of how I write. I think online, is a great vehicle and a great device to use. You can use so much, you can connect so much online. Especially, I'm on Instagram, and it is really. I've learned so much on Instagram just because there's so many other poets. Rupi Kaur, the best-selling poet, she used to be an Insta poet. That's all she was. So there's a lot out there for everyone. But the main thing, all that notwithstanding, eventually you just got to sit down and write yourself. Write what you want to write.
Yeah, I agree that online is really a great way, especially nowadays, being on social media is so big. So I think especially for the younger generations, that's probably going to be their go-to way to do it.
Yes, exactly.
My older sister actually writes some poetry, and she would post it on Tumblr. So yeah, I think.
Yeah, I've seen. I'm on Facebook and Instagram, and I put poetry on both. The only reason I'm there is for poetry. If you look at my Instagram, I think I have 800 posts and probably 790 of them are poems. So yeah, it's a great device. It's a great outlet.
Yes. So speaking of like Instagram and building a community online, collaboration and community engagement are essential aspects of poetry. So how do you engage with fellow poets, whether it be online or outside of that? And do you find collaboration to be a fruitful endeavor in your creative process?
Yes, in person, I collaborate with a lot of poets around here. My predecessor, Laura Ross, the first poet laureate of Lake County, is a terrific poet. And a lot of times I'll just bounce ideas off of her and just, because sometimes you just lose your objectivity, you know, and you want to see how you write a poem and you let someone read it and they're like, what message did you want to send with this? And I tell them and they're like, I didn't get that at all. And you can only get that from other poets and other people. So I like the in-person thing, but online, especially on Instagram, they do Instagram lives all the time. And you can send your poetry in, and some really good voice poet will read it in front of a lot of other poets. And you can hear what it sounds like. And it's a great editing tool because you hear someone else reading your poetry and you say, well, there's a pause there, or too long of a pause there, and you can go back and change things.
Yeah. So nice free critique.
Exactly.
That you can get.
Exactly. Read this and let me take notes.
So you mentioned, you go to the former poet laureate a lot.
Oh yeah.
Would you say that's another role? Like, would you? Is it kind of like her own choice, or would you be, for example, be expected to be a mentor for the next person?
I don't know if I would be expected to be, but I would be.
Right.
Most of the things I do not because I'm poet laureate, is because I'm just a poet.
Right.
And I'll continue to do, I have an annual event at the Howie Mansion. I'll continue to do that even when my term as poet laureate is over. So, but if the next poet laureate, or if any other poets out there come to me for any kind of assistance or help or anything, I'll always be there for them.
Right. That sounds like that's just the type of community.
Yeah, it's the community. It's not the poet laureate. Yes.
Wonderful. So as we celebrate National Poetry Month, what message or advice would you like to share with aspiring poets and poetry enthusiasts who are tuning in right now?
Well, my advice would be to get off the driving range and just get to the first tee. Just start writing. Don't show it to anybody if you're not comfortable. Don't post it anywhere online. I would say start writing, and when you are ready to share it, just make an anonymous Instagram account and connect with a bunch of poetry sites on Instagram and share your work with them. You can use a different name. You never have to post your picture, and people will give you input and opinion on your poetry, and if that's what you want. But more than anything, just write. It's a great outlet. It's like therapy.
Yeah, that sounds completely true. I 100% believe that. I think I fall into the category of the ones being intimidated. I always often feel like I can never put my feelings or emotions properly into words.
Yes, and that would come with time. Just use Instagram as a platform. On my Instagram, I think there's one picture of me. My last name is never on there. Well, I think it is for my website, but I don't, it's just a poetry thing for me. It's not a life thing. I don't post pictures of, my step grandkids or anything like that. You can be as anonymous as you want. And even, I'm Jims.pen on Instagram. What are you going to get from that?
Right.
And even the stuff I post, it's not the least bit controversial. I think a lot of people get on there and rant and do poetry slams and talk about Gaza and talk about all these other social issues and everything. And I have my opinions and my interest in all of them, but I think it makes for boring poetry coming from me. So I leave all that alone. No one can get on my Instagram page and find out how I feel about anything.
Yeah. So you kind of just need to find out what works
Exactly.
for you, what topics you
Yes.
believe in and that
Yeah.
you want to talk about.
And if you want to be a social issue poet, you got a lot of company out there, and you're going to be embraced if that's your thing. I'm a narrative poet. I write about, emotions and stuff. But whatever you want to write about, you can write about what it feels like to be a chair, and you're going to find people out there that know exactly how you feel.
Yeah. So I also want to ask, so when you're writing, like you said, you talk a lot about emotions, some of them, I'm sure being your own, and then others where you're putting yourselves into someone else's shoes and how they might feel about it. When someone is reading your poetry, do you want them to get a certain thing from your poetry, or are you okay with it, like it can be up to interpretation? How do you feel about that?
Well, I must admit that if I want to send a specific message and the person reading it receives a different message, I feel like I missed the mark. But it doesn't really matter, though, because I think any poem can send a lot of different messages because there's so much in a poem. Even a micro poem, 8 lines long, 6 lines long, a lot of people are going to draw different things from it, including me. I mean, if my message is ABC and from it you get DEF, well, at least you got a message from it. And I'll listen to your thoughts on it, and I'll reread my own poem. I may even rework it before it goes into a book. So I use people that read my poetry out loud as an editing tool. I listen to them and I make changes according to what I hear.
That makes sense. And we talked about the intimidation of writing poetry, but I think also people are sometimes scared to even just read poetry.
Yeah, I was never afraid. I just don't think I'm a very good live reader. So on Instagram, they're constantly, all my friends are hammering me to, come on for an hour and read. I hesitate to read my own poetry. I would never even try to ever read someone else's poetry. I just mess it up. But as far as live readings and groups and stuff, it's an easy way to get started. Just people sitting around at a table just like this.
Right.
Just it's your turn to read. Just go ahead and read. But getting up in front of people at a podium and a microphone, that's a whole different story. I just remind myself that they've never heard this poem, so if I screw up, they won't even know.
They won't know. Yeah, I mean, I would agree it's probably good to start in a casual environment.
Yes.
Where hopefully the people around you are encouraging and not judging, and they just want you to do your best.
Yes.
And then you can make your way up to when there's, might be hundreds of people just staring at you from a crowd while you're at a podium.
Yeah, just pick a face and just stare at it and just read to that person.
Right. So now, if you want, if you could pick a poem for us that you might read to us.
Sure. I will pick the one that's about the twins in the womb.
All right.
Obviously, it's not autobiographical, but it's in my 2 books ago. The book is called Everything Left Alone Remains Beautiful. Everyone calls it the horse book because there's a horse on the cover. Okay. This is called Lament for Little Man. Excuse me. All I know of my brief life is being next to you. We've never been apart, you and I, side by side, intertwined, sharing life. Little man, I don't know how it happened, but you've been deprived of what you need to live, and thus of life itself. A biological mishap, I suppose, a twisting of your food source, a blockage perhaps. No one is to blame. It is the way of things sometimes. I can feel your faint, struggling heartbeat in perfect time with my own, as it should be. Within our safe world, I've touched your face 1,000 times, kicked you, hugged you, and loved you like a brother should. But you will not survive our birth. They will try with their machines to save you, but they won't succeed. We both know this, because during this time of creation, we're closer to God than we are to the world, and He shares with us as He does with all unborns. You have already heard your upward call, pulsing through your tiny, battle-weary body, and I have heard its echo. I don't know how my life will be different. There will be much that I must learn without you, but I do know that tomorrow is our day, so today is our goodbye. I love you. I know this because we can feel our mother's love. So we know what love is. It's the only emotion we understand. It's the only emotion a newborn feels when they arrive. Every newborn begins their life at the beginning of a single orbit, so every life returns to its beginning. I will be with you again when my circle joins. My memory will begin tomorrow, so everything I know about our time together will soon be forgotten. It is the way of things. But I'll always have the feeling that something is missing. Goodbye, little man, my brother, my friend, my twin.
Wonderful, thank you. Yeah, I can definitely see how you said how you do more narrative. I get that, and that's probably like, I felt like I could follow the poem the whole time, because I'm probably one who doesn't often read poetry, because sometimes I feel like I don't get it, right? But yeah, I can totally see where you were coming from. I understood the whole journey going through it.
Yeah, it's just a little story. Narrative poetry is a little story. It's got a main character, things like that. It's an easy way for me to write. It's not the only way that I write, but it's what's come naturally to me.
Yes, and obviously I can see the relatability, especially probably to someone who may have gone through that experience, whether it be a mother who only gave birth to one of the two twins, or someone who was meant to be a twin, and then their twin didn't make it.
That is true, but to be honest, I don't write to be relatable. But most often it happens, especially if you write about love or heartbreak. I mean, it's going to be relatable, but that's just not necessarily. I mean, I wrote from the point of view of a tree.
Yes.
I mean, I really don't believe that a bunch of trees are out there reading my poetry.
Right. Well, depending on what you said about the tree, it could still be relatable.
That is true.
Do you have maybe one more for us that you would like to read?
Sure. I'll read one that's called All That Matters. A lot of times I'll write, my last book was micro poetry, which is just very, very short. And sometimes I'll take a bunch of ideas that I've just sitting down and I just write a couple lines and then get up and move on and carry on with my day. And then I'll take all those lines and I'll try to put them into a single poem and find something similar. And it's kind of like a Frankenstein poem, pieces from everywhere. So this one's called All That Matters. One day you'll know for sure what your dreams have tried to tell you, that the stars are not the ceiling, but the floor, that light and darkness are places, not descriptions, that what you confess to and what you must answer for are very different, that death is not a wall, but a passageway, and everybody lives forever somewhere, that no matter how good you've ever felt, you've never been free of pain, that memories are not reminders, but evidence. And no matter how many times you felt alone, you never really were. You'll know that the purpose of fear is not to make you afraid, but to compel you to reach out. There was never anything to be afraid of. You'll know that your life was never meant to be an opportunity to gather or achieve, although the time allowed for such. When your last page turns, you'll know that what you learned and accomplished along your journey was unimportant. This chapter will end as all chapters do. Only then will you know that all that mattered, all that really mattered, is what you believed. Much different than the first poem.
Yes, that one was quite uplifting. I liked a lot of the messages in that one. Now, not to put you on the spot, but sometimes we talk about book recommendations. So do you have any poetry book titles that you would really recommend to people?
Yes. I would recommend Ocean Vuong's book called Night Sky with Exit Wounds. That is an excellent book. Anything by Mary Oliver. My predecessor, Laura Saubert Ross, has a book called The Trees Will Remain, a brilliant book of poetry. And Rupi Kaur's first book, which is called Milk and Honey, she's had 3 or 4 books now, and they're descending. Her first book is pretty brilliant, though. So those are the books that I would recommend.
All right, well, thank you. And is there anything else you just want to say, or maybe anything that you want to plug that you're going to be doing soon, or event or anything like that?
Well, I have an event this evening, actually.
Oh, really? Get on it.
Yeah, it's probably a little too late for that. But it's at the Book and Barrel in Mount Dora. And I have some private events planned, but I think the only thing that I would want to plug is that if anyone's interested in my poetry at all, they can go to my Instagram page, which is jims.pen, jims.pen, and there'll be more there than you can stomach.
All right. Well, I just want to say thank you so much for coming on and being my first guest outside of the staff to be on our podcast.
I'm honored to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
All right. And thank you, everyone listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and please join us again next time on Circulating Conversations.